So I didn't quite account for the height difference of husband and wife in the microphone distribution. Next time we'll have 2 mics. We'll be better prepared. We've been, of course, going through this letter that Paul's writing to the church in Corinth, and it's, like all churches, it's a really messy place, and they're trying to figure things out, and they're making a lot of mistakes, and they have a lot of questions about things. And today, that's a rather long passage that they read, and I know it's just rich with a lot of stuff. I probably could do at least 3 or 4 sermons on just that passage alone, the divorce and the married and the unmarried and the widows. And what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to exposit it today. I'm going to talk about it, but not go line by line, not go subject by subject, but rather I want us to see the general message of what Paul is trying to communicate to these people, what they're struggling with, and then what his answer through the gospel is for what they're struggling with. And really what they're struggling with can be termed relationship status. And you guys, most of you are very familiar with the screen. This is, if you ever want to get the most attention on Facebook, go and change your relationship status, right? That's where you're going to get the most attention. If you go, try it out today, just mess with your friends and go and, if you're not engaged, say you're engaged, and then you get what? Likes, and then you have that awkward, friend who's been married for 10 years, but they just signed on to Facebook, and then they say they're married, and it says, Joe Smith is now married, and you're like, wait, did you tell your wife that you're now married? There's always, relationship status is something that we pay attention to in this culture greatly. It made me think of the movie Social Network, of course, about the creation of Facebook, and the Mark Zuckerberg character. There's that scene where he's in the computer lab and he's staring listlessly sort of at the computer, and he's almost at the point where he's finished coding Facebook. He's almost done with Facebook, but he knows he's missing one key piece, and he's staring listlessly at this computer in the lab, and he's almost dozing off, and his roommate comes in and sits next to him, and his roommate says, hey, that girl who sits behind you in class? And Mark Zuckerberg's character says, yeah. And he says, what's her status? Is she seeing anybody? And then you see the camera kind of zoom in on him, and a light goes on in his head, and then he knows this is it. And he runs out in the snow, and he's in his shorts and his flip-flops, as he was wont to do back in college, and he runs across the quad, and he goes into his room, and he feverishly codes this last piece, because he knows that the relationship status is something that we're all drawn to marry, not to marry. Who's married? When are you going to get married? Why aren't you married? Why am I not married? Why did I get married? Who am I going to marry? Am I single? Why am I single? How long am I going to be single? We are borderline obsessed with relationship status. What's interesting is that nothing much has changed in 2,000 years. And this church in Corinth is also, too, extremely obsessed with their relationship status. This is what they're struggling with this morning. They're struggling with the concept of marriage in the life of a Christian and singleness, and being single or being married in the life of a Christian. And Paul's writing to them to try to sort all this out. To marry or not to marry. To be single or not to be single. These are pressing issues. You have to put yourself in context here. These are Corinthians. So if you're a single Corinthian, like you're single, you're not married, you've been living the wild life. We talked about that last week. To Corinthianize means to live it up. And you're a single person, and you now convert into this new faith. Your question then is, do I get married? Do I have to get married? Should I remain single, or should I get married? Maybe I have to get married because maybe that's the Christian thing to do, and you're struggling with that. Or imagine this, and Paul's addressing these people too. You're married, you convert, but then your husband or your wife, they say, no, it's not for me. So you're struggling. You say, well, then should I not get married to this person? Should I break off the marriage? Should I end it? These are real issues that these people are struggling with. To marry, not to marry, to be single. What is marriage? And Paul's writing them, and he's going to challenge them, as you'll see. He's going to challenge their cultural presuppositions. At Bible study on Thursday night, I shared this. This is me talking, as Paul says, I, not the Lord. This is Aric, not the Lord, saying this. If you look at Paul's writings, the number one thing that he's concerned about is challenging your cultural norms. Paul, throughout all of his letter writing, wants to challenge the culture that you and I come from. Your cultural perspectives on money, on success, on marriage, on relationships. Paul is all about challenging all of your cultural assumptions. This is why in 2 Corinthians, in the next letter that he writes to them, he tells them in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, you're a new creation. The old has passed away. And he's not saying some spiritual, he is being spiritual, but he's actually being very practical. He's saying, listen, people, however you view marriage, money, work, relationships, whatever it is, I want you to challenge it. Because more often than not, it's going to come from your cultural foundations. And the gospel is here to blow that all away, to give a completely new perspective on relationship status. The church is messy. And Paul's addressing this from what I'm going to, there's two predominant strains of thought that are going on in the Corinthian church. And believe it or not, it's not too dissimilar to what goes on in our world today. So I'm going to summarize it this way. I'm going to give them titles, and it's bad English, I know. I'm going to call it the Neverbees and the Gotta-Bees. Okay? I know it doesn't make much sense now. Hopefully it will after I explain it more. The Neverbees and the Gotta-Bees. And Paul is addressing both of these. And both of these threads still exist in our culture today, and definitely in the church. The Neverbees. First, there was this idea, if you look back in your Bible in verses 10 through 16, there was an ideology spreading in the church now that somehow marriage was bad. You didn't get married, or if you were married, get out of it. Because it was restrictive. It was prohibitive. It held you back from what could fulfill you. This is why they say at the beginning of chapter 7 that we read last week, he says that some of them in the Corinthian church were saying that even a husband and wife shouldn't even touch each other. See, what they're saying is marriage is a distraction. Get rid of it. Get away from it. Flee from it. And Paul himself actually even kind of admits this in verse 33 and 34 when he says that marriage will distract you a little bit. But what the Corinthian church was doing, the widows, the virgins, the single people, they were saying, I'll never be. I'll never be held down. I'll never be tied to the old ball and chain. I'll never be. I'll never be. Why? Because marriage to them and marriage today to many people directly conflicts with their personal goals of fulfillment. It goes like this nowadays. You'll hear people say, I won't get married, or right now I can't get married, I have to focus on my career. Or I'll get married later maybe, but right now I really need to work on me. These are the Neverbees of our culture. The Neverbees. And it most often happens in big cities when single people move to big cities. Why? Because they're there to build their resume. They're there to get fulfillment, to find their personal goals. And marriage is going to block that, and they know it, so they say, I'll never be. In the Corinthian church, people were saying, I'll never be. Marriage is a distraction at best, a ball and chain at worst. And Paul's later going to give them an answer. I'm going to identify these two people, but Paul gives them the answer of what the gospel says about a never be. But at the root of a never be is a person who says, I'll never be married. Marriage is not for me. Singleness is the way. But why? Because singleness lets me fulfill my goals, fulfill myself, be free to do what I want when I want, and not be bound by the laws of marriage. Consequently, if you want to know a lot of never-bees, go to New York City, live there for a little bit. You'll meet a lot of never-bees, for sure. Some of you who lived in New York are shaking your head. Yes. Because in New York City, there's a lot of people who go there and say, I'll never be. Why? Because right now it's about me. Their singleness is about them. Their dislike of marriage, their distrust of it is about them. And it's got brutal consequences. See, never-bees think that by not getting married, they're fulfilling themselves, when in actuality, they're cheating themselves out of the beauty of what marriage can be. Let me give you an example. I'm going to read this for you in a second. Talk about New York City when Harry met Sally. Do you remember this scene? When Sally is Meg Ryan's character sitting down with Harry, Billy Crystal's character, and Meg Ryan is the ultimate never-be. She's the ultimate never-be. I'll live with him, but I won't get married. And she's talking about a recent breakup she had with a guy named Joe. And she broke up with Joe, and she said they weren't married, they were living together, and now she's telling her good friend Harry about this relationship. And she says something very, very indicative and identifying for what the result of being a never-be does. The never-be says, I will never be married. Why? Because singleness lets me be fulfilled. but really does it. Here she says this. She looks at her friend Harry and she says, when Joe and I started seeing each other, we wanted exactly the same thing. We wanted to live together, but we didn't want to get married. Because every time anyone we knew got married, it ruined their relationship. Children ruined their marriage. Their marriage ruined their freedom. And she said, Joe and I always said to each other, we can fly off to Rome at a moment's notice. And then one day, she says, I was taking Alice's little girl for the afternoon, her friend Alice, because I promised I'd take her to the circus. And we were in the cab playing I Spy. You know the game, I spy a mailbox, I spy a lamppost. And she says, the little girl says, I spy a man. And the little girl saw a man with a woman and two kids, and one of the kids was on the man's shoulders. And the little girl says, I spy a family. And Meg Ryan looks at Harry with tears in her eyes and says, I started to cry. You know, I just started weeping. And I went home that day and I said to Joe, you know, the thing is, we never do fly off to Rome at a moment's notice. She was the ultimate Neverbeast, saying, this is what I want. I'd live with you, but no marriage. But in the end, she breaks down because she realizes that while she thought she was fulfilling herself, the never-be-ness of her was not fulfilling in any way. Those are the Neverbeasts. What about the gotta-bees? And he touches on this in verse 8. It's a little hard to see. But you got to know what's going on here. In verse 8, he talks about these unmarrieds, and they're wondering if they should get married. There was a strain of thought in the church at the time that you had to get married, or something was wrong with you. There's a strain of thought, on the other hand, there was the Neverbees who said never be married, but there were the gotta-bees who said, I gotta be married. I gotta be married. I have to be married. I can't be single. It's this idea that somehow marriage will complete you, and without marriage, you're incomplete. And so these people were wondering, you know, I gotta be married, and Paul says, whoa, hold on. Really? Because what they were looking for was marriage to fulfill them as well. See, the Neverbees look to personal fulfillment outside of marriage. The gotta-bees look to marriage for fulfillment. The gotta-bees are the people who say, I have to be married or else. Why am I not married yet? What's wrong with me? And wait a second. I know some of you married couples are here this morning, and you say, well, I don't fit into either of these two categories. Oh, really? More often than not, married couples fall into the gotta-be married category. It's when you look at your friends, the single friends in your life, and you say, when are you going to get married? When? Come on, you know, you give them that friendly little nudge, right? It's nice, it's all in jest. But what you're really saying is you got to be married. You got to be married. This is the ideal. You got to be married. And this is what people were doing in the church to these widows, to these virgins, to these people, these singles. They were looking at them and saying, you got to be married or something's wrong with you. The interesting thing about a never-be and a gotta-be, they're on the polar opposite spectrums of marriage. One says never be married because it'll block your own fulfillment. The other side says you have to be married or you'll never be fulfilled. And while they're on the ends of the polar spectrum, at the root they're the same thing. They're saying either in your singleness or in your marriage, it's number one about you. See, the never-bees use singleness as a way to fulfill themselves. The gotta-bees use marriage as a way to fulfill themselves. Fundamentally at their core, both of these ideologies that Paul is addressing in the church are fundamentally selfish. They're rooted in the same idea that your fulfillment and my fulfillment is of paramount importance. And either we flee from marriage to find that fulfillment, or we jump into marriage to find the fulfillment. And Paul says if you do either one of those, you will be ruined. There's a quote in your bulletin from Tim Keller in his book, Meaning of Marriage, and I won't go read the whole quote. You can read it. It's printed for you. The gist of what he's saying is just this. Either if you over-elevate marriage into the ideal, it will never fulfill you. But if you over-elevate your singleness to the ideal and your personal freedom, that will never fulfill you as well. Paul says it's neither or. You neither are a gotta-be or a never-be. If you are, you will always be unfulfilled. So what's the answer then? Here's the answer. It's Amazing Grace, the next song. But here's the longer answer. And it comes in verse 17 and verse 24. Paul's answer to them is this. He's going back and forth, and he's giving rules. And I know there's the thing about divorce. That'll be a whole other sermon, or you can talk to me afterwards. It's complicated. I can't touch on that in too much detail today. The gist of it is this. Paul's going back and forth saying, if you're married, stay married. If you're unmarried, stay unmarried. If you're this, if you're that, stay. Verse 17 and 24, it all boils down to this. Stay as you are. Relax, Paul says. Chill out. Don't be a gotta be, don't be a never be. He's basically saying, calm down, people. If you're absorbed in your singleness, you'll never find fulfillment. If you're absorbed in your marriage and you elevate that as the ideal, you'll also never find fulfillment. You can only find fulfillment by staying where you are. Why? Because Paul says in verse 29, the appointed time is short. What he means is Jesus is coming back real soon. So relax. If you're single and you're worried about marriage, relax. If you're married and you're worried about your marriage, relax, Paul says. He says, remain where you are. Why? Because there's something greater that's coming back. Now, let's be honest. Paul, writing this letter, he had this idea that Jesus would come back next week, pretty much. That's pretty much his idea. And it's a fancy term. I'll whip it out. I'll tell you to prove to you that I actually did go to seminary. It's called realized eschatology. Isn't that a fancy term? Realized eschatology. Basically, Paul's saying, Jesus is coming back next week, people, so why bother? Don't worry about it. Chill out. And you may say, well, no, that's 2,000 years ago. We know Jesus didn't come back next week, so what am I going to do now? I'm lonely, I'm single, or I'm married and I'm upset, I'm happy in it. And Paul's message still stays the same. Relax. Meditate. Meditate on the fact that Jesus has already cosmically broken into this world. He's already come and started to make things anew. For Paul, he thought that would be finished in about a week or two. We know that's much longer, but the message still says the same. If you and I meditate on what Jesus did for us, by cosmically altering the landscape, we'll start to have an eternal perspective. Your singleness will look like a grain of sand in the span of things. Even your marriedness will look like a grain of sand among the things. You'll get he looks at these people and he says, guys, see the long game. Look at the end game of this. He's coming back. And when he comes back, it'll be the greatest union that you've ever known. So why worry? Why stress in either your singleness or your marriedness? How do you get there? Doesn't that sound good? You're like, okay, Pastor, you're telling me, don't stress about my marriage, don't stress about being single. Great. How do you do it? I got the magic formula. It's called the gospel. And Paul talks about it here. Look at this in verse 22. He says, listen, people, if you want to get to the point where you can eternally relax, where you can cosmically chill out about your singleness or about marriage in general, he says the only way you're going to get it is to know that something's happened to you, that you were bought with a price, and now you're a slave to the greatest Lord of all time. And you say, well, what does that have to do with anything? Why does being a slave to Jesus have anything to do with anything? How does that even help me? How does that help me in my singleness? How does that help me in my marriage? Let me say it this way. I know many of you have gone to church for many years, and you probably have heard a pastor like me stand up and say, be a slave to the Lord. And you're like, what does that even mean? I'm a slave of Jesus? That's not the deal I signed up for. Here's what Paul's saying. Be a slave to the only Lord and Master who accepts you outside of your performance. He says, be a slave to the only Lord and Master who looks at you and say, you're accepted even when you don't perform. Any other master of your life will make you perform. If you're a gotta be person, marriage, you're going to have to perform. You're going to have to perform for your spouse. Your marriage you're going to sink or swim with the quality of your marriage. Because remember, you've got to be married. You put marriage up on the clouds now in the throne. And it'll forever crush you with anxiety and worry and stress. You will rise and you will fall with the happiness of your marriage. But if you're a never be, you will rise and fall with the master of your own fulfillment. If you don't succeed, you'll be a failure, and that Lord and Master will crush you. Paul says this morning, look to the only God who gave his life up for you to buy you with a price. To the extent you know that you're a slave to him, you'll be free from being a slave to anything else. Nothing else will rule you. Your singleness or your marriage will never rule you if you know that you're a slave to him who died for you. He says, I bought you with a price. I've come. Yes, I want to be your Lord. Yes, I want to be your king. But he says, don't you see, when all is said and done, I want to be your lover. I want to be the spouse of all spouses to you. You fret about your singleness now. You fret about your marriage now. Look to him on the cross as the ultimate marriage partner. He says, I bought you with a price so that I could embrace you. You be my slave, Jesus says. You let me rule over you, and nothing else will rule you. You'll be free. See, Jesus wasn't a gotta be, because he didn't need us to fulfill him. And he wasn't a never be, because he didn't need himself to fulfill himself. He was a want to be. He wanted to be the ultimate marriage partner for you and me, the ultimate Lord and Master. He wanted to embrace us. There's that old hymn, come ye sinners, poor and needy, weak and wounded, sick and sore. Jesus ready stands to save you, full of pity, love, and power. Come ye weary, heavy laden, lost and ruined by the fall. If you tarry till you're better, you will never come at all. And the chorus rings out, I will arise and go to Jesus. He will embrace me in his arms. In the arms of my dear Savior, oh, there are 10,000 charms. You ever really want to be hugged by somebody? If you're a gotta be, you're going to have to be hugged by marriage, and it'll leave you unfulfilled. It's just a shadow. If you're a never be, you'll always be hugged by selfish ambition, and that will never fulfill you. Let me close by saying this. I'm going to embarrass my wife a little bit here. We hug each other, of course, and because she's petite and I'm, well, not petite, I like to give her a big bear hug every once in a while, and hold her up and kind of swing her back and get the back cracking, and it's nice and it's warm and it's snuggly, and I think she likes the bear hugs, and I like the bear hugs because I get to hug her and hold her, and it's a wonderful embrace, and it's great because after 8 years of marriage, we still do the bear hug and we still do the back cracking, and it's wonderful. And I say that to make you feel like I'm very romantic, and some of you are smiling, and that's nice. Let me tell you though, the embrace. That embrace is great, and I'll say it's the greatest embrace I've had, but there's a greater embrace yet to come. And if I don't know this embrace, I'll forever be putting all my weight in that embrace. And my marriage is great, but it's a pointer to something even greater. I will arise and go to Jesus. He will embrace me in his arms. In the arms of my dear Savior, oh, there are 10,000 charms. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, the gospel says he died for you. What more do you need? Stay as you are. Get married. But know that it is just a shadow of what he offers you in his embrace because of the cost of what it took him. I want to close with one practical note, and this is a biggie. I've heard a lot of people say to me, I like this church, but there's too many singles. I've heard some people say to me, not here, maybe some people said it to me. I've heard other people say, I like this church, but there's too many married people, not enough singles. Don't you see what Paul is saying here now? Singleness is nothing. Married is nothing. The gospel is everything. And this necessarily and practically means that if you're married, you should be actively trying to be around singles. And if you're single, you should be actively trying to be around married people, because all are good, none are the greatest. The gospel is the greatest. The gospel is what unites us and brings us together. The good news that all of us, single or married, kids, no kids, we're all bought with a price. So spend time reaching out to people who aren't like you. Be blessed by them. Go to small group with them. Pray with them. Married, single, families, all together. And Paul says it's the gospel that does it, because he's our master, nothing else. Go now in silent prayer. Pray to God over this message as Victor comes up to lead us in our final song.